Republican leaders in Florida just agreed to spend more than $80 million to buy a tiny piece of property in the Panhandle, spending more than $20 million an acre for this land, which makes it one of the most expensive land acquisitions the state has ever made through its environmental conservation programs. And that money is going to be paid to businesses that are majority owned by a prominent real estate developer and Republican Party donor. This land deal, which one longtime conservation leader in Florida has called a sham, was made possible by a little line that was slipped into the state budget near the very end of this year's legislative session. We're going to tell you how that happened and how it led to this. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics, but with a particular focus on the ways that big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. That name, Seeking Rents, comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking is what's happening when someone with lots of wealth and influence, like a big business or a billionaire, uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else. Okay, so back in mid-June, literally just a few hours before Florida's Republican-controlled legislature finalized this year's state budget, GOP leaders in Tallahassee slipped a sentence into the spending plan authorizing state officials to acquire a piece of property in the Panhandle through a popular land conservation program. About 3 months later, the administration of Florida Governor Ron DeSantis used that little line in the budget to spend more than $80 million of taxpayer money on a tiny spit of vacant beachfront land in Destin, Florida. Land that records show was majority owned by a prominent real estate developer and Republican Party donor. And immediately after that, the state's Republican-controlled cabinet, that's Attorney General James Uthmeier, Chief Financial Officer Blaise Ingoglia, and Agriculture Commissioner Wilton Simpson, they immediately signed off on this extravagant purchase price, which, by the way, at more than $20 million an acre, was more than 10 times the price the developer and his partners had paid for the same land less than 10 years ago. That sentence in the budget, the line that enabled state leaders to pull off a land deal that one longtime conservation leader called a, quote, sham, came from a lobbyist hired by the landowner. That's according to emails that we obtained here at Seeking Rents through one of our public records requests, one of the public records requests I've mentioned before that we put in near the end of this year's legislative session. This is about as gross as it gets in Tallahassee, and it's actually even uglier than you may realize. And we're going to explore why that is in just a sec. Before we do, though, as always, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe. And if you can, leave a show rating or review. These are the sorts of things that help us grow the show, spread the word sort of thing. Also, if you have not already, please think about signing up for a subscription to the newsletter itself. That'll have all our stories and podcasts emailed straight to your inbox. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. Nothing we produce is behind a paywall, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for a subscription if you can afford one. If you do have the means, please consider those voluntary paid subscriptions. The revenue we get from that is super important. Helps us cover the cost of reporting expenses, like the public records request that led to the email helping us to unpack this shady land transaction in the Florida Panhandle. Also, one other quick reminder. I mentioned that I would be talking about this at the end of our last podcast, but this is largely based on, not largely, this is going to be a podcast version of a story we've already published on the newsletter, breaking a lot of this stuff down. Okay, so with all that stuff out of the way, let's unpack what exactly happened here and why it's so gross. So 2 years ago, Florida lawmakers set aside $850 million to spend buying land for a project known as the Florida Wildlife Corridor. This is a bipartisan effort. It's backed by everyone from environmentalists to hunters to essentially stitch together a massive swath of undeveloped land, basically running the length of the entire Florida peninsula. And the goal here is to establish like contiguous habitat for wildlife, everything from black bears and Florida panthers to scrub jays and gopher tortoises, just making it easier for wildlife to exist rather than sort of buying conservation land that is isolated and disconnected from all around it. You're trying to preserve entire ecosystems. Obviously, $850 million is an enormous amount of money. And so not all of that has been spent yet. And so this year, the legislature added a provision to the new state budget, the current one we're in now, the one that took effect July 1st, authorizing state officials to continue spending down all that funding for the Florida Wildlife Corridor. But lawmakers threw some extra instructions into the budget with that money this time around. And specifically, the legislature ordered that a portion of these Florida Wildlife Corridor funds be used to buy a particular piece of property in Okaloosa County. This is in one of the Gulf of Mexico counties in the Florida Panhandle. The exact piece of property was never actually spelled out in this line in the budget, but it was written in such a way that it was specifically meant to refer to a 4-acre parcel next to a public park in the city of Destin. Now, few people noticed this at the time, but then, as I mentioned earlier, a few months later, the DeSantis administration used that budget provision to agree to an $83.3 million deal with the property owners. And the property owners in this case are a pair of limited liability companies that records show are majority owned by a guy by the name of Robert Guidry, a developer who does business in both Florida and Louisiana. Guidry is also a very large donor to Florida Republicans. So campaign finance records show, for instance, that he gave $250,000, $250,000 to Ron DeSantis during DeSantis' first run for Florida governor back in 2018. He has, perhaps not coincidentally, more recently been giving to members of the Florida cabinet, which happened to sign off on the governor's deal here. So, for instance, records show that a few months ago, he gave $25,000 to James Uthmeyer, the DeSantis-appointed attorney general, who is one of those 3 guys on the Florida cabinet. Yet another business controlled by or managed by Guidry gave another $25,000 to kind of a random political committee, but one that immediately turned around and also gave $25,000 to Blaise Ingoglia. That's the DeSantis-appointed chief financial officer who also serves on the cabinet. So DeSantis and the cabinet, which again also includes Agriculture Commissioner Wilton Simpson, formally approved this $83 million land deal on September 30th. And I should say that, to my knowledge, Guidry has not responded. Robert Guidry, the developer who majority owns this land, has not responded to requests from comment to a bunch of newspapers that have been digging into this, with the Tampa Bay Times, the Orlando Sentinel, Politico Florida has done some good reporting around this too. As far as I know, he has not responded. I have not seen him respond to comment anywhere. I will do another check before I actually post the show. And if there is a story where he's commented on it, I'll make sure to throw that in the show notes too. As you can imagine, and maybe if you're in Florida, you already know this, but this has exploded into a statewide controversy. One former director of the state park system, a guy who, by the way, used to work for Ron DeSantis. So this isn't some whatever the equivalent of a never Trumper in Florida might be. This is a guy who worked for Ron DeSantis. He told the Tampa Bay Times that, quote, money was being stolen from the Florida Wildlife Corridor to enrich a donor. So yeah, pretty controversial, pretty unpopular. And it was all made possible by these budget instructions that were given to lawmakers by a lobbyist for this developer. And so let me walk through more about that part, because one of the things I am most fascinated in is how stuff happens like this, like what made it possible. And so the records obtained by Seeking Rents show that a lobbyist representing one of Guidry's companies, one of the companies that owned this land that the state bought, sent an initial draft of this budget language, this sentence that got slipped into the budget near the very end, sent it to an aide to Senator Jay Trumbull. Jay Trumbull is a Republican from Panama City. That's the Panhandle. I believe his district includes Destin. I should note that these emails show the lobbyist wasn't working alone either. So these records also show he had support from the DeSantis administration himself via the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. That's the agency that oversees the Wildlife Corridor program. And so there was a follow-up email in which the lobbyist for Guidry's lobbyist resent this language to Trumbull's aide, in which he mentioned, quote, "We sent this over to DEP and they are good with how it reads." So This was not a situation where the DeSantis administration was hands off. It was very much hands on in getting this language into the budget. Now, we should talk about this guy, Jay Trumbull, because he is quickly becoming one of the most powerful people in the Florida legislature. And that's because he is lined up to become president of the Florida Senate in 2028. So the Florida Senate, the president of the Senate and the Speaker of the House are the two most powerful people in Tallahassee outside of the governor by far. Now, Trumbull will become Senate president only, though, if Republicans win enough legislative elections both next year and in the 2028 elections that they retain their majority in the Senate. As long as they do that, Jay Trumbull will be Senate president. That makes him a very powerful figure in Tallahassee. And the future Senate president here personally had this language from Guidry's, given to him by Guidry's lobbyist, inserted into the budget. He has acknowledged this to Politico Florida in one place. And I'll throw a couple of stories into the show notes about this for beyond just the story we wrote on Seeking Rent, so folks who want to dive more deeply into the stuff can see all of this stuff, including the piece where this transaction was called a sham, and that where the former parks director said the state leaders are essentially stealing money to enrich a donor. And this whole system, this whole chain right here, where the lobbyist for Guidry gives Jay Trumbull language, Jay Trumbull has it put into the budget, it's obviously unseemly, but it's actually, like, again, more unseemly than you might realize for a few reasons. First is the money. I mentioned earlier that this guy, Robert Guidry, and his companies are pretty significant donors. Well, the lobbyist sent this language to Jay Trumbull just 2 weeks after another one of Guidry's LLCs put $200,000 into political committees controlled by Republican political consultants who work for legislative leaders. Remember, Jay Trumbull is going to become Senate president in 2028, provided they win enough elections over the next 2 cycles for that to retain the majority. This $200,000 is going into a committee that is designed to help Republicans keep their majorities in Tallahassee. What's more, this budget language not only directed Ron DeSantis and the Florida cabinet to buy this land, which is important because, generally as you're spending land conservation program money, there's a whole process to rank properties. Like, what are the most priority properties to acquire, given that you don't have infinite resources? And it takes into account like the ecological value, the urgency of acquiring them before development. All sorts of factors go into this. And this property was nowhere to be found on this. It was nowhere near the top of this list. And so this budget language not only sort of had the effect of bumping this property to the top of the list, it also made that astronomical purchase price possible. And here's how it did it. The provision itself doesn't specify any kind of purchase price. But what it did do is give the DeSantis administration permission to avoid getting an independent appraisal on this land before agreeing to buy it, and instead allowed them to use an existing appraisal that had been commissioned by the landowner. And it just so happens that Robert Guidry was already sitting on appraisal for $83.3 million. Again, for 4 acres of land, $80 million for more than $80 million for 4 acres of land. And so that's how you get the cabinet suddenly agreeing to this astronomical price, because the legislature, this language in the budget, made it possible. And then here is one of the parts that I think, people should understand, because it makes it so galling to me, is the fact that Jay Trumbull and the rest of the leadership in the Florida Senate, and also the House too, as we'll explain, hid this proposal from the public until it was too late to do anything about it. And here's what I mean by this. So the emails that we got through these public records requests show that the developer lobbyist first gave Jay Trumbull this language on, I'm looking down to make sure I get the date right, on March 25th. And that was 3 days before the Florida Senate published its first draft of the state budget. That's where the first version of the budget becomes public. And anybody who cares about this process, me, everybody else, we comb through all the line items looking for stuff that smells funny, smells fishy, for lack of a more technical term. And for folks that don't understand, both the way the budget process works is the House and Senate both each begin by passing their own budgets, and then they get together and negotiate a final budget. But Senate leaders didn't put this language into their initial budget, nor did they add it to the budget over the next week or so when they made, and this is true, I went back and checked, nearly 200 amendments to their budget during committee hearings and floor hearings on it. They made all these changes, but they still didn't put this language in the budget. Instead, the Senate waited until the very final day of what is known as a budget conference to spring this. And budget conference is that frenzied period at the very end of each session when the Senate and the House finally get together with their original budgets and negotiate that final spending plan. Now, if you have never been through a budget conference, it's crazy. It is about the least transparent process there is in Tallahassee, a place that, is not exactly renowned for transparency. Essentially, what you have happening is a very small circle of Republican leaders, like the House Speaker and the Senate President primarily, with their budget chairs involved, make a bunch of decisions in secret, make all the decisions in secret, in fact, and then they have them publicly ratified through like a series of just blink and you miss them public hearings. These they're called conference committee meetings, but these things are more kabuki theater than they are public hearings. Again, it is hard to explain how preposterous this is, but essentially these meetings get gavelled in and lawmakers race through these tiny font spreadsheets that have just hundreds of line items in them, race through these things without ever explaining what any of them are. There is almost never any substantive debate. It is like unheard of for there to be questions asked in any of these meetings. These meetings often wrap up in a matter of minutes. In fact, the conference committee meeting where the Senate finally proposed this budget language that had been given many weeks ago, the conference committee meeting where it finally proposed this, the entire meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. The House of Representatives agreed to put it in the budget without ever asking a single question about it. Again, asking a single question in public, and that's important here because I don't believe for a second that the Speaker of the House and the budget chair of the House didn't know exactly what this language was, what it was for, and what it was going to do, but they made all those decisions and they asked all those questions in public or in private. They never said anything in public to tip anybody off about the game that was afoot here. As you can imagine, this is a process that leaves everyone on the outside, and that includes journalists, activists, lobbyists, even rank and file legislators, all the lawmakers that aren't part of the inner circle of leadership. It leaves all of those folks on the outside almost no time to figure out what is going on, to try to track down the details of all the new items like this or all the funding shifts that suddenly surface in these tiny font spreadsheets that they're racing through in matters of minutes. And that is critical. That's the entire game here. And because when budget conference ends, again, that this right at the very end of session, when budget conference ends and that final deal is done, it cannot be changed. Nothing, no matter how controversial it is, no matter what you learn, even if you learn something 24 hours later that shows it's the most corrupt deal imaginable, nothing can be amended out of the quote final conference report, which of course makes it the perfect way to sneak a shady land deal into law. Now, I want to add one other thing here, because there was a guy who could have solved this, and another guy who I don't believe for a second didn't know what was going on, and that's Governor Ron DeSantis. So one of the powers that the governor of Florida has is a line item veto. He can strike individual provisions in the state budget. He could have stopped this from happening if he'd wanted to, but obviously he did not. And why on earth would he want to stop something that would help a guy that gave Ron DeSantis $250,000? Like I said earlier, this is about as gross as it gets in Tallahassee. So, okay, I wanted to put that story into the podcast because, like I said, there's not a complete overlap between the audience for the podcast and the folks that read the newsletter. So, if you're one of those folks who only listen to the podcast, maybe check out the newsletter. We got in-depth stories there, lots of details about this. You might actually check out the story too. We've got screenshots of a lot of what I'm referring to, and you can see those. You can see in more detail what we're referring to here. Before we go, just run through those requests that I made off the top one more time, if you can. Please click like or subscribe and leave a show rating or review. Help us spread the word about this content and keep growing the Seeking Rents brand and making more folks more aware of the work we're doing here in Florida. And again, please, if you have not already, think about signing up for the newsletter itself. The easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. That will redirect you to the Substack page that we publish on. And that'll make sure all of our stories and podcasts, if you're just a podcast person, you'll still get your podcasts that way. They'll email directly to you. And like I said earlier, please do consider doing a voluntary paid subscription. You don't have to. All the content is available to everyone, regardless of whether or not they pay. But if you can afford a paid subscription, please think about doing it. This is the kind of journalism you're supporting when you do that. Okay, so we're going to leave it there. I will be back again next week. We've got another committee week in Tallahassee, so we'll recap some of the bills moving ahead of the 2026 session, which is getting awfully close. Begins in January, but a lot of work is happening right now. So until then, take care. Thanks for listening. Take care.